all things work together for good to them who are the called according to his purpose is sometimes very, very difficult to accept. How do you accept with thanksgiving the death of a child, a young parent, or the loss of a job? 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "There hath no temptation befallen you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it." Verses like this are almost impossible to accept unless you understand one. You fully believe that God cannot and will not lie. Two, that you are very aware that God is much, much smarter than you are. For some people, that's hard to realize. Job, an exceedingly intelligent man, comes to understand that his knowledge is nothing as compared to God. Isaac Newton, one of the most intelligent men who ever lived, and a devout Christian, is asked, "Aren't you proud of your accomplishments and your knowledge?" He replies, "God's knowledge is as all the grains of sand on all the beaches of the world. I am as but a child who has picked up a few grains of sand in comparison." 3, understand that man lives in the here and now. The future and the past are unreal to man. With God, the past, present, and future are as one. 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. In our previous talk about events which took place over 100 years ago, Moses and Susan Carver, George Washington Carver, Mary Washington, and Norman Borlaug did not have the faintest idea that the result of all the trials and tribulations they suffered would result in the saving of over 1 billion lives from starvation and illness due to malnutrition, lack of food. Or that the 1 billion continues to grow every day. God knew what he was doing, but they didn't. He always knows what he's doing, whether we know it or not. If we could see beyond today as God can see, if all the clouds would roll away, the shadows flee, or present griefs we would not fret, each sorrow we would soon forget, for many joys are waiting yet. Trust and obey. If we could see, if we could know, we often say, but God in mercy and in love a veil doth lay. We cannot see what lies before, and so we trust him all the more. He leads us till this life is o'er. Trust and obey. The Civil War consumed the lives of over 500,000 men at a time when the population of the United States was probably less than 10 million. The Vietnam War consumed the lives of 50,000 men, 1/10 as much, when our population was about 200 million people. The deaths in the Civil War were probably as great as all the other wars that the USA fought combined. The result of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery. In Great Britain, all the millions of slaves in the British Empire, and there were a lot more slaves in the British Empire than there were in the United States, were freed without a single shot being fired. How could that possibly be? After all, the slave trade made many, many influential people very, very wealthy. The answer? All things work together for good to them who are the called according to His purpose. Mrs. Newton was a very devout Christian who prayed every day that her son John would become a pastor. Her husband was the captain of a slave vessel. Why would God take the life of Mrs. Newton at an early age while her son John was barely in his teens? Mr. Wilberforce was an extremely wealthy and successful businessman. Both he and his wife were nominally Christians. Mrs. Wilberforce was a beautiful woman, but had a tendency to fall completely apart in stressful situations, while her husband was forceful and strong under the most stressful situations. Why would God allow Mr. Wilberforce to die and Mrs. Wilberforce to have a nervous breakdown? Why? Because God had a plan. Now, we were not aware of the plan, and neither were any of them. But nevertheless, God had a plan. Without the steady influence of his mother, John Newton went to sea on a slave trading vessel while he was yet in his early teens. The owners of the vessel realized the intelligence and competency of John. So, in his early 20s, he was promoted to captain. Slavery, of course, was in effect virtually from the beginning of time. You recall reading about Joseph and Jacob. You read that the brothers of Joseph sold their brother to an Arab caravan traveling west to Egypt, where he was sold as a slave to Potiphar. The Arab caravan continued going east to west and west to east, selling slaves as they went. In the year 1200 or so, Marco Polo, his father and brother, traveled by caravan to China. The valuable spices and riches they returned with many years later inspired the Spanish and Portuguese to try to find the sea route to China. It took too long by land. An agreement was made between the Spanish and Portuguese to draw a line north to south. The Portuguese had the seas east of the line, and the Spanish had the seas west of the line. The Portuguese tried to sail around the Horn of Africa, but failed many times. The Spanish sailed west. In the 17th century, the English ruled the seas with some activity by the Spanish and Portuguese. The ships of England, Portugal, and Spain participated in the nefarious trade of slavery. In Africa, as a result of tribal wars, the losing tribe was sold into slavery to an Arab caravan, which brought the slaves to the west coast of Africa. The white men themselves were terrified of going inside Africa because of the malaria and other diseases which would invariably kill them at a very young age. So the Arab caravans brought the slaves to the coast of Africa, where they were then sold to the ship's captain, who then traveled to the New World. The slaves who survived the long trip, and I think it's important to know that more than half of all the slaves that went on the ship were not alive when the ship reached the ports that they arrived at. They were dead, they had died, and were just thrown overboard. After the long trip, they reached the ports of the USA, the islands of North America, and South America. How could God use a slave captain to free slaves? God works in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. God in kindness took Mrs. Newton home early to save her the despair she certainly would have felt at the acts of her son. How could God have known? How could she have known God's total plan? In God's time, John Newton became convicted and converted. It's amazing, the grace of God. It's not amazing that he wrote the song, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." How could God save a person even as wicked as John Newton? I ask myself the question, how could God save a soul as wicked as me? I think we all need to ask ourselves that question. In God's time, he became convicted and converted and became one of the greatest preachers in English history, and of course, the author of Amazing Grace. When the Wilberforce family had their first child, they were told the child could not survive more than a few days. From birth, he suffered from what we now think was Crohn's disease or severe colitis. Though always in pain, he was very frail and very small. But he survived. This put his mother under tremendous stress. When William was only 5 or 6 years old, his father died. His mother had a nervous breakdown and couldn't manage to take care of the child. What to do? She delivered her child to her sister, who, strange as it seems, but all in the plan of God, was an evangelical Christian whose pastor was, can you guess it? John Newton. The boy fell in love with the Newtons, and especially with Uncle John. He spent so many days and nights growing up in the house of John Newton. Growing into his teens, he became a Christian. He loved his Uncle John, and his Uncle John loved him for the child that Uncle John never had. William became a devout Christian and naturally began to write letters to his mother about Jesus and salvation. The more letters he wrote about it, the more disturbed she became. She was not a Christian. She was concerned that her son would become a Christian. Why? Well, she depended on her father-in-law for her sustenance. Perhaps you're aware of it or not aware of it, but under British law at that time, a wife, a daughter, a mother could never inherit the estate of their loved one. That's pretty terrible, isn't it? It is. But that's the way it was at that time. She depended totally on the kindness of her father-in-law, who could cut her off at any time. She knew he was violently opposed to evangelical Christianity. So she pulled the boy away and sent him to boarding school. While he continued to have strong values, his lifestyle did not mirror his conviction. Romans 7:14. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. For what I want to do, I do not, but do that which I hate. As a very young man, just age 21, Wilberforce became the youngest member of the British Parliament. As a result of his intellect and his phenomenal ability as a public speaker, he had great influence on the Prime Minister. It was actually believed that one day he would become the Prime Minister of England. But God had better plans for Mr. Wilberforce. In the midst of heady fame and good fortune, the Holy Spirit brought him under a conviction that so devastated him that for many days he was unable to accept the grace of God that could save even so reprehensible a sinner as he knew himself to be. There was no question in his mind. He knew who he was. He knew the depth of his sin. How could God forgive a sinner such as he? After a long period of deep conviction and deep physical stress, with his illness, he yielded his life to Christ. A great problem arose in the mind of Mr. Wilberforce. How could he, as a Christian, who not only believed Christ, but also sought, as he knew he must, to live a life pleasing to God and continue to serve in the Parliament? By his choice, he had been estranged from his beloved Uncle John. In the midst of his deep concern and condemnation, he went in secret during the night, as Nicodemus had done 2,000 years before, to seek the answers to his questions. He appeared by night at the home of his beloved Uncle John, the former slave trader and the author of Amazing Grace. Now, by the grace of God, John Newton was one of the most influential of all ministers in all of Great Britain. Uncle John received him warmly. He was overjoyed at the transformation of his favorite nephew. Wilberforce wondered how could he maintain his relationship with God and serve in the Parliament. It just seemed impossible. He felt he must resign from Parliament and was willing to do it to maintain his relationship with God. Newton responded, "Do you remember the words of Esther's uncle Mordecai, which he had for his niece Esther when she perceived a terrible dilemma?" Esther 4:14. "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish." Who knows? Who knows? But you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. Wilberforce responded, "Uncle John, how could God use a sinner such as I?" Uncle John responded, "But you have forgotten the grace of God toward me, a man guilty over a considerable period of time of the most reprehensible sins." By the grace of God, Wilberforce remained patient. He had speaking ability that could hold the people on the edge of their chairs. After a relatively short period of time, Wilberforce was invited to meet with a group of very important, influential people. The group of individuals, mostly Christians, was active in a movement to abolish slavery in the British Empire. It is important to realize that a large part of the great wealth of the British Empire was a direct result of the abomination slavery. The overwhelming majority of businessmen violently opposed the abolition of slavery. After all, their wealth was directly attributable to the vile institution of slavery. Their faith in evolution made them think of Africans as an inferior people who deserved to be exterminated. It is hard, almost impossible to believe that the Planned Parenthood that they rave about today had as one of its founding principles the eradication of the Negro race. When one considered in Great Britain, abolition was accomplished without a shot being fired. 50 years later, it required the death of 500,000 men and incredible suffering to abolish slavery in the USA. To believe abolition could be accomplished without bloodshed was almost too much to believe. The group told Wilberforce that they knew, they had found out, that he was opposed to slavery in all its forms, which was true. They felt God had called him to lead the forces of abolition. Wilberforce was deeply moved, but found it difficult to believe that God could use such a one as he to lead in such a monumental act that had to take place. And so, again, by night, he goes to his beloved Uncle John, who listened intently to the words of Wilberforce. He reminded Wilberforce again of the words of Mordecai to Esther. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Wilberforce responded, But how could God use for such a work as this a creature as vile as I? Uncle John responded, William, have you forgotten how vile and depraved was my condition before the grace of God delivered me? Wilberforce was deeply moved, and the rest is history. After many years of struggle, on February 23rd, 1807, Wilberforce rose from a bed of severe ulcerative colitis. In agony, he spoke for hours, holding Parliament on the edge of their chairs. Mesmerized by the force of his words and under the unction of the Holy Spirit that spoke through him. When the vote was taken, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. Sometime thereafter, his frail body succumbed to the pain and anguish he suffered throughout his life. William Wilberforce, though frail of body, was a Christian giant among men. A question arises. Would William Wilberforce have become the giant he became were it not for his relationship with his uncle John Newton? Would John Newton have become the great man he became if not for the prayers of his faithful mother? Had Mrs. Newton depended on what she could see and not trusted he who we cannot see, would William Wilberforce become the giant he became? And would the abolition of slavery in the British Empire have occurred without a single shot being fired? It is true, we cannot see beyond today's clouds. Clouds do shroud the future in darkness. But can't we trust He who can't lie? We ask, why do bad things happen to good people? Today we know that in order for God's perfect will to be accomplished, the abolition of slavery needed to take place. Today, Mrs. Newton, John Newton, William Wilberforce know that the severe trials that come into our life come not because God hates us, but rather because He loves us and seeks to conform us to His image. Now we see in a mirror the imperfect image of Christ, but then we see the image of Christ clearly. For we shall see Him, for we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. If we could see beyond today as God can see, if all the clouds would roll away, the shadows flee, o'er present griefs we would not fret, each sorrow we would soon forget, for many joys are waiting yet. Trust and obey. If we could see, if we could know, we often say, but God in mercy and in love a veil doth lay. We cannot see what lies before, and so we trust Him all the more. He leads us till this life is o'er. Trust and obey. Thank you.